Hello and welcome to another update. In this one I'll be covering the latest developments throughout the front line, where today's focus will be around the Kupyansk area, the Robotyne-Sermeyorsk front of the Zaporizhzhia front, and the Bakhmut area by Klischiivka. We'll be going through some of these territorial changes as well as developments in these areas, and then we'll be looking at some Wagner stuff. So starting out, we go to the Kupyansk front, where here the Russian forces have yet again advanced. This is a very interesting development, as the Russians are now constantly advancing here in the Kupyansk area, as well as generally on the Luhansk front. So over the past few months, the Russian forces have advanced slightly bit by bit, more than the Ukrainians have been in this part of the front line, although both of them are essentially not on the offensive, and that is because there's no real gathering of troops for a spearhead similar to what we're seeing in the Zaporizhzhia front. What we're seeing in this part of the front line is that there is a lot of units spread throughout the front line in smaller groups, trying to hold the front line on both sides, and then whenever one of them see an opening or see an opportunity, they try to take it. So there's a lot of back and forth in this part of the front line. We see the Ukrainians slightly advance here by Debrove. They managed to push half of the Russian spearhead across the Serbets River back. They did a lot of changes on their side, and then now the Russian side is pushing heavily in the northern parts after they previously last month pushed in the southern side. So they are switching a lot around. They're trying to concentrate their forces in a bit that the Ukrainians do not notice it until it happens, make a small push, and then try to hold their positions and then move elsewhere to make a push there, which is why we're seeing the back and forth between the two sides, because once they switch their focus one place, they'll be weaker in this other place, and then the other will take advantage of it, and then it repeats. However, recently the Russians seem to be having the upper hand due to their advance in firepower, but they also have a large numerical concentration in this part of the front line, as the Ukrainian sources have mentioned, 900 tanks, 100,000 units, generally a large concentration of forces on the Russian side in this part of the front line. They have the 1st Tanks Army, so they have a whole army that is focused on the tank warfare. They have 2 tank divisions, the 19th Tank Division and the 4th Guards Tank Division. Both are located in this part of the front line, one by Svatove, the other by Kreminna. So the Russian forces have a lot of tanks and armored equipment focused on this part of the front line, on top of the 100,000 soldiers on this part of the front line. So there's a lot of units here, but they're not using them for an offensive operation, at least not yet. Why do I believe that there's such a huge concentration? First of all, both sides are reporting it. Deep State Map has that many units located here. Ukrainian officials have reported on that. There's constant influx of weapons to this part of the front line on the Russian side. They even sent a lot of T-90Ms. They had the test run for the BMPT Terminator here. So this is generally the best supplied and most concentrated area on the Russian forces for the Russian side in this war. Compared to that, the other areas are less supplied or less concentrated. The Zaporizhzhia front is generally so wide that it is more than the Luhansk area, but that is only because they have 2 whole regions, or essentially 3 whole regions, where they all are concentrated in this one part. And that is because Crimea, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia all focused by the Zaporizhzhia line. There's a lot of units here in the Kherson region as well to counter any potential Ukrainian advance through the Dnieper River. But most of the units, I would say for a wild bet, at least 80% would be located here in the eastern part, with about 10% on each of the other regions, mainly due to the fact that the Ukrainians would have to cross a river or the sea to reach these other areas, which the Ukrainians do not have the capabilities to, as they do not have enough amphibious landing equipment or generally any navy to accomplish such a task. So if the Ukrainians were to launch an attack across the Dnieper River, that would be the most likely one. But even in that scenario, they would have to cross a river line, which makes it very difficult for them to actually launch an offensive through that direction. So logically, most units on the Russian side would be located around the Zaporizhzhia area. So that would be the most concentrated part of the front line. But there's also a huge concentration in comparison to the size and the importance of the Luhansk area. The Russian forces have a lot of units here, and that is main reason is that they have a lot of supplies that goes through there. It's close to Belgorod, it's close to Rostov, all of the areas, major cities in the area are close to that area. And generally, the numbers coming from Russian officials, we know that the partial mobilization mobilized about 300,000 troops. That was the goal. According to the numbers officially given, it was somewhere around 320,000. And then a recent number by Medvedev, he claims from January 1st to today, or somewhere around August 3rd, 236 Russian people volunteered for the army. This puts the amount of mobilized and volunteers from January 1st or from October last year till August this year to be around 580,000 on top of the soldiers they already had, on top of the DPR, LPR. Also, Western media and Ukrainian officials claim that the Russians are also mobilizing the locals at DPR and LPR in Kherson and Zaporizhia, which would put another 50,000 on top of that. So the Russians could easily have around 750,000 or 800,000 troops in Ukraine. That is if they fully commit all their units. And once the 236,000 volunteers are finished training, they could reach 800,000 troops in Ukraine. In comparison, the Ukrainian forces have 150,000 around Zaporizhia, somewhere around 200,000 the rest of the front. That's 350,000. If they have matching that number across all of Ukraine, that is a big if, then they would still be outnumbered by the Russian forces. This is without counting Wagner, because there's a lot of different assumption about that. There's a lot of different news, so we will return to that later. But essentially, the Russians are severely outnumbering the Ukrainians right now, on top of having more firepower, on top of having an air force, all of these things. So generally, the Russians have such a huge capability right now, yet we're not seeing them do anything. And as I've said before, it is essentially the Russians have not done any offensive operations since over a year ago. The last quote-unquote real offensive was around the Severodonetsk, the Klischiivka area, where there was only a very small contingent of Russian forces involved. There was mainly the Chechen forces, Wagner forces, and DPR and LPR soldiers. Even in the Uledar area, there was mainly DPR soldiers, there was Russian Marines, but it is not really clear if it was even Russian soldiers, because it could easily have been DPR soldiers. The commander was a DPR general, and the DPR forces at that time had been incorporated into the Russian army, which would indicate that it could easily have been DPR soldiers as well. Either way, the Russian forces have not in a large-scale operation since essentially the start of the war. And the question here lies, is the Western media correct? Does the Russians have already run out of tanks after 2,000 tanks? Or is it that they are scared to do it? Or is it that they are incapable of doing it? Or is it because they are planning for something big and they're going to strike hard at some point? According to personal accounts from Western foreign soldiers in Ukraine, as well as some cherry-picked interviews across the front. So I'm not going to put too much weight on this because it could easily be cherry-picked. But according to them, the general morale and general assumption of the Ukrainian soldiers is that they prepared so long for these forces, but at the same time, the Russians had also prepared. We keep talking about how the Russians prepared the defensive line. Yes, it is very impressive. They spent 6 months building 5 lines of defense, but that wasn't the only thing they were doing. If that was the only thing they were doing, then they were definitely slacking off. They've mobilized 500,000 troops, 300,000 mobilized, the rest are volunteers, and then they have trained these, they have equipped a lot of units, all of these things. They have not been sitting idly by, they have been training a lot of units, they have been equipping a lot of units, and therefore the general assumption between Ukrainian soldiers on the front line, according to this info, is that the Russians have a large offensive force that they have not put into use yet, and it is going to be stronger than the Ukrainian forces, and the Ukrainians have not prepared defenses as strong as the Russian defenses. So their general assumption is that something bad is going to happen to the Ukrainian forces soon. If the Ukrainians do not succeed with this, it will have a terrible outcome because the Russians would be ready with their own offensive. And that is also the assumption I have. This is why I call it cherry-picked, and I will not put too much weight on it, because it could easily just be confirmation bias. So I'll let you guys in the comments decide. Also, a quick note, if you have any Telegram channels with a lot of pro-Ukrainian footage, I would like to have you invite me to that, because from the sources I have, there's not a lot of Ukrainian footage anymore. I don't know if it's because there's a lack of Ukrainian footage being sent, or if it is just generally that the Ukrainians are not sending any footage. Whichever the case, if you have a Telegram channel that posts a lot of Ukrainian footage, make sure to let me know so I have that information as well to combine with what I have currently from my sources into my analysis. Moving on to the Robotyne and Sarmayorska areas. So starting out by Robotyne, there's a lot of fighting here on both sides. The Ukrainians restarted their attacks. There is this video here of a Bradley burning, and that is from a pro-Russian source. So as I said again, most of my videos come from pro-Russian sources. If you have any pro-Ukrainian sources, make sure to let me know. But yeah, with this video, we see that generally that is the videos I'm seeing from this part of the front line. So that is the general trend. The Ukrainians attempt attacks, they get hit by artillery, mines, and so on, and then they retreat. And that is what we've seen. They have advanced multiple times. That is because they are able to break through some of these minefields. They are able to break through some of these defenses, capture some of these trenches. We don't get any of those videos. So most likely it's because the Ukrainians are not sending any videos. As we saw from their offensive trailer, they had. So yeah, maybe they're just not willing to send any information to the Sarmayorska area. In a previous video, I mentioned that the Ukrainian forces are now attacking across the river line towards Urushaina. And in this attack, there was some sort of river crossing with a tank. We have the video here, which showcases a Ukrainian tank just driving into the river. And then some other Ukrainian soldiers jump into the river to help them because they are drowning. Not really sure what kind of tank they thought they were riding, but it's definitely not one that swims on water. Maybe they thought they were riding a real leopard and not a fake one. Finally, we move on to the Bakhmut section where there's been fighting by Klischiivka, and the Ukrainian forces have managed to advance for the first time since the 27th of July. So they managed to capture this part here to the north of Klischiivka. Since they couldn't move further and in the southern parts, they're trying to move in the northern parts, clear some of these forest lines, and allow them to then move towards the rail lines. After this, move into the village from this northern part, and then they would be able to attack from 3 directions rather than 2 directions, which would allow them to focus the artillery fire on the Klischiivka area and essentially drive the Russian forces out. If they cannot storm and capture the village, then they will be able to at least push the Russian forces out of the village, which would leave it in a gray zone, and they would be able to then launch their attacks further eastwards and then take advantage of the situation then. So step 1 would be driving the Russian forces out of Klischiivka. However, the Russian forces are responding by sending further reinforcements to this part, so they're definitely focused on holding the area. And one of the ways they're achieving that is that they're generally attacking with artillery on whichever concentration of Ukrainian forces there is. As we see in the video here, there is some artillery strikes on a Ukrainian concentration of forces around the Bakhmut area. Finally, we have some news about Wagner, and the news here is that there is a very high probability that the Wagner forces will just be sent to Africa. And then you may be wondering why, because there may be a large-scale war brewing on the western part of it. So just a short summary, the countries of Mali and Burkina Faso had recently had some coups overthrowing the presidents, and the coup leaders have since invited Wagner forces in and kicked French and American forces out. Those have mostly gone to Niger, as this country right here. And since then, Niger recently had a coup a week or so back. And that is, the new leader is now essentially calling for Wagner and pushing out French and American forces. Then there is a organization called ECOWAC, which is a West African Economic Union for these countries. It includes Nigeria and other countries which are essentially much stronger than these 3 countries. They are threatening to militarily intervene in Niger. Niger has since gotten support from Mali and Burkina Faso, who both agree on helping Niger. There is this map here by Syriac Maps which shows the different alignments. And generally there's a lot of issues here, and Wagner is a central part of those issues, as well as France, the United States, and generally the general stability of the region is under huge threat due to a lot of insurgencies going around the countries. I'll be making a video about this dedicated to this part, and I'm going to make a whole video about it, so make sure to check it out when it comes out, and there'll be a lot more information about it. But essentially, the Wagner forces, they may be sent here. According to official numbers, there's somewhere between 50 to 250,000 troops in Wagner totally, including all of the African soldiers. According to Remy, this number changes every day, but currently active total troops is about plus minus 120,000. This includes the ones in Belarus and the ones spread throughout Africa. We can get a rough overview of that with this picture here, but essentially Wagner forces may be fully relocated to Africa, and that is most likely going to happen if some sort of large-scale conflict breaks out between the ECOWAS countries and the coup triangle, as I call it. So generally there is some sort of cold war in Africa between African nations themselves trying to demand their own way through this, the ones who are aligned with the West and the ones who are aligned with Russia and Wagner. And then Wagner has a significant presence in Africa, since their main operations are essentially located here, and that they have huge amounts of soldiers, recruiting a lot from Africa and also sending them around to different countries, getting paid for that, and also extracting a lot of natural resources there. So there's a huge political game going on in Africa between the two sides, and this is all connected to the war in Ukraine. So make sure to check it out when I come out with that video to explain parts of it, and I hope you all enjoyed this one. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.